Hey, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? Good morning. Monday morning, we appreciate you coming out. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Center. And on behalf of my colleague Howard Wolpe, our director of our Africa program and the LEAD program, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to a discussion this morning of creating opportunities for peace through regional trade in the Africa Great Lakes region. It's a thrill for us here at the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center to be hosting today's really sneak preview of this report, a report that is not yet out. And so this is one of the few opportunities for, as I said, a sneak preview before it comes out here shortly. Let me just say a word about the Woodrow Wilson Center, because I think we see a few new faces here in the Environmental Change and Security Program. You're sitting at the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson, so as our only president who had a PhD, Congress decided to set up a formal memorial that reflected that legacy of scholar and politician, where these two worlds could come together on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis to engage in exactly the kind of discussion we will have today, understanding the new analysis on pressing current policy dilemmas and challenges here in the United States and abroad. So we're thrilled to have today's discussion under that rubric. The Environmental Change and Security Program is going now on a 14-year program that really tries to understand issues of environment, demography, health, and development within broader foreign policy, security policy, obviously today trade policy context. But certainly if we're talking about natural resource flows in the Great Lakes region of Africa, you have all that wrapped up together. So it's appropriate for our discussion today. I'd like to thank, as usual, is commonly the case, many of our programs here at the Center are supported very generously by USAID. In this case, Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and I'm thrilled to say now what is going to be a new collaboration that brings in the Conflict Management and Mitigation Office, as well as the natural resource folks and the biodiversity team. So we're looking forward to a series of meetings in that respect. And if I misplaced my Post-it note here, I'll give you an advanced preview of some of the things coming down the road. On the 21st, we'll have a presentation of the UNEP Post-Conflict Branch Sudan Environmental Assessment. October 2nd, we have a Shape of Things to Come, a Population Action International report that looks at demography and conflict and security issues. October 5th, Too Poor for Peace has Lael Brainerd from Brookings, Colin Cowell now from Georgetown, and Henrik Erdahl looking at demographic and environmental connections to natural resource conflict and cooperation. And finally, on November 7th, we'll have a presentation of a new book on peace parks from Salim Ali, University of Vermont. So a rich set of discussions on this topic, a number of them covering some of the same parts of the world that we'll discuss today. So let's turn to our speakers and get on with the program. We're very fortunate to have, well, I would say two AID folks, but as opposed to just 2 weeks ago, Jay Singh leaving AID, we've been very active, and Nick Bates has come over from Difford in the UK and to talk about this report that they have put together in many ways in collaboration with USAID, and so we're thrilled to have that. Nick is a senior political analyst in East and Central Africa unit from Difford. Career in the British Diplomatic Service, lots of postings. I suppose Kampala is the most appropriate and relevant to today's discussion. But after that, he continued to focus on the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes in multiple manifestations and formats, and really has been focusing on these issues of natural resource flows and trade in the Great Lakes. And so we're thrilled that he's going to present this report. Ruth Buckley, I think, is known to many of you here in town, in fact, here in the building. She's AID's Africa Bureau, providing support to the missions and formulating policy here in Washington on a range of issues, a lot of field experience in Africa grappling these issues. She's been tremendously helpful to us here at the Wilson Center as we try to understand how a variety of issues in the AID portfolio relate to whether we're calling it fragile states or real rebuilding states or states that are in conflict or immediate post-conflict settings. So it's terrific to have Ruth here as well and help us kick it off and set the scene, so to speak, from the USAID perspective. And as I mentioned, Jay Singh, who's been a friend of the project for many years, until very recently, based in Nairobi with USAID as the, now I'm going to get it wrong here because he's got so many parts of this, Senior Regional Conflict Democracy and Governance Advisor at AID's regional mission in Nairobi. Jay's someone, back even to his dissertation, is focused on natural resources, conflict, and cooperation in this part of the world. And so both from an analytical side and policy side, lots of experience. Now starting in a new chair, so to speak, at ARD, based in Burlington, Vermont, and still focusing on a lot of these issues. So it's terrific to have Jay back at the Wilson Center again. So Ruth, why don't I turn the floor over to you, and we look forward to today's session.
Great. Thank you. On behalf of USAID's Africa Bureau, and particularly USAID East Africa, the regional mission, I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and in particular Jeff DeBalco of the Environmental Change and Security Program for hosting this event and creating an opportunity for us to discuss the study on trading for peace. I'd also, of course, like to thank you all for sparing the morning to come and talk with us and discuss these issues. USAID is increasingly interested in the development problem posed by extractive industries in turning the vicious cycle of opaque, corrupt extraction that feeds conflict and instability into a virtuous, transparent cycle where good governance supports equitable development and poverty eradication. No small challenges, I think you all know. Extractive industries was identified as a cross-cutting theme, particularly for the Africa Bureau in 2005, and it's now considered a key issue under the Secretary of State's Foreign Assistance Framework. The U.S. government is, as you probably know, working to support Kimberley process implementation. It's also working on the Development Diamond Alliance in Sierra Leone, transparent timber extraction in Liberia, and we've worked with the artisanal mining sector in Tanzania and Madagascar. Through our Global Development Alliance, or public-private partnerships model, we're also working with governments, the private sector, NGOs, and the local communities to build better governance and transparent revenue flows associated with extractive industries in Guinea, Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In support of the Paris Declaration and our collaboration with other donors, especially DFID, we've been working with DFID on many projects. With the World Bank, we've signed compacts with different Nigerian state governments. We're working on non-state policing in southern Sudan, a strategic conflict assessment in Kenya, and of course the topic of today's presentation, which is the product of a collaborative process between USAID, DFID, and the Common Market for Eastern and Central Africa that began in 2006. The work comes at an important time in the evolution of the COMESA countries' efforts themselves to consolidate and build upon the achievements made in conflict resolution and mitigation to date in the DRC and Burundi. It's supported by high-level commitment of the International Conference of the Great Lakes. And I'm going to let Jay talk a little bit more about the evolution of COMESA's engagement in extractive industries in general. USAID East Africa's contributions to conflict mitigation in the Great Lakes have all been channeled through COMESA, including the incorporation of civil society and the private sector into COMESA's peace and security work. I think without further ado, I want to thank Jay and Nick for their tireless efforts in helping us to understand the true nature of natural resource flows in the Great Lakes. And they're now going to articulate in more detail both the process of collaboration and the results of the study. So I'll turn it over to Jay.
Thanks, Ruth. As Jeff mentioned earlier on, I'm no longer with USAID, so I'm not speaking on behalf of USAID. I'm going to put that disclaimer out there. And I see a lot of familiar faces, and I feel quite humbled actually talking to all of you because I'm sort of cog in the wheel in this whole process. And this has been a collaborative process from USAID Washington and in the field, and I just feel I'm just providing context to this whole process. And I thank Cynthia Brady for organizing this event, and of course Jeff and people at CMM and Africa Bureau. I'm going to sort of jump around a little bit because as Nick will talk about the technical issues on extractive industries, what we struggle with at USAID or the U.S. government is how do we operationalize these technical information that we get. And that's always been the challenge for us. We've got great information, but it's never targeted enough so that we can program an activity that's regional in nature. And by design, most diplomatic efforts and missions are bilateral in focus. So doing a regional program becomes very tricky because now you've got bilateral missions who have their own priorities and their own relationships with different their governments. and tying that all into a regional framework is extremely difficult. And that was our biggest challenge, reconciling sort of a regional approach versus a bilateral approach. Because Rwanda, if you're from Rwanda, you got a Rwanda approach to this, you got a Uganda approach to this, or your DRC approach to this. And a lot of times there are opposing approaches because of the issues of relationships with the governments. So tying that all in was very difficult. So we had to come with a theme that was non-threatening to all the member states, primarily Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC, that could tie in, and we can sort of measure peace or security through that framework, and that was trade. So that's what we picked up on. The other issue basically was, from a donor perspective, we didn't want this to be a donor-led process. This had to be an African-led process. So our relationship with COMESA, the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, was a natural link. And over the last 5 years, USAID East Africa has been funding COMESA and set up a peace and security desk. That's primary objective is to look for ways to build peace regionally. And so through that support, we could channel this effort. So those are sort of the challenges we had. So we had to find an African partner. We had to find a framework to develop this process, and then, of course, implement it. Let me just, before I go on any further, talk about sort of the history of this evolution of this strategy that USAID and DFID are embarking on. Basically, I think you can start back to 2003 if you want to go back in time and just pick an arbitrary date. In Dar es Salaam, USAID REDSO back then, or East Africa now, organized a meeting on Great Lakes, and that sort of set in motion a number of papers and dialogue at the front office level here in AID of how do we look at the issue of the Great Lakes, peace and security and trade in the Great Lakes. And that sort of, and then a number of white papers funded by CMM and Africa Bureau sort of took bits and pieces of it and made it more robust in terms of understanding different elements of it. And then in 2005, in November, we had a small senior staff meeting in Kinshasa that included staff from USAID Uganda and Rwanda, as well as Burundi and Congo, to sort of sit down and figure out what can we do from a regional perspective, because the issues of Laurent Nkunda, the militia, the flows of minerals and coffee, for example, were causing a lot of issues that we couldn't really grapple from a bilateral perspective. So back in, I think, after the meeting, we drafted a draft strategy, but because of funding issues and things changed in the agency with a new administrator, that sort of was there put on the back burner. However, a chance telephone conference with the International Conference in Great Lakes put us in touch with DFID. Nick Bates and I on that phone call, and we were talking about our programs, what we wanted to do, and I think we connected at that point, kind of like, a platonic relationship here. That led to a number of joint TDYs to Zambia to talk to COMESA, to talk to the Ugandan ministers, especially the Office of the President, to get their take on this and their buy-in, which was very important for us before we could go any further, was to get their perspective on what they want to see and then make this a demand-driven process rather than a supply-driven process. And that took time. That took about, I think, 6 months to get that built up. But I think DFID went on by themselves to Rwanda and talked to the Rwandan ministers, and we talked to Ugandan and Congolese folks, and that sort of built a demand-driven process of how do we build trade and make sure that every country that's participating in trade gets an equal share of those resources. I think I'm going to sort of at that point sort of leave it there because. I'm going to sort of step into the next domain of what the trade flow was. And one of the things we decided earlier on was we didn't have a really focused paper or research on trade flows. We got tons of stuff from Global Witness, a lot of stuff from International Alert, but we wanted them consolidated in a manner that we could start programming. And we wanted to look at the number of key border areas. And we looked at the borders between Zambia and DRC, Burundi and DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC. Just figure out where are the meeting points and find out what we can do there at different levels, from the national level, from regional level to national level to at the local level, what can be done to mitigate the insecurity that's going on, as well as build ways to enhance peace through trade. So saying that, I'm going to sort of turn it over to Nick and let Nick take the bulk of the work here on discussing this study. That, by the way, this collaboration between DFID and USAID is, I think, in many ways quite unique because it sort of blossomed out of just pure pure interest of a few offices, in Africa Bureau Roots office, and then CMM in the Dacha Bureau, and our mission to sort of get this thing rolling and find innovative ways, despite the funding crunch we had in the government here in Washington, to do things in collaboration with other donors. We haven't really opened this up out yet to other donors at this point, because we wanted to get our ducks in a row before we actually got the Dutch and the French and the Belgians involved. So with that, Nick, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. And I have to say, there seems to be a separation between the audience and the panel here that I hope isn't a reflection of a divide between government and academia and civil society. But anyway, I am delighted to be here in Washington to come and bring this this bit of research that we've been engaged on with USAID and COMESA. I'm particularly delighted to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work. Howard Walpe and I go back some 6-7 years now to a time when Woodrow Wilson and Howard were really developing some extraordinarily innovative work on leadership training that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. We started that off as with a little bit of seed money from both USAID and DFID to get it going, and it has been a program that has not just taken off but is flying, and has been, I think, enormously influential in Burundi, where it started in very, very difficult circumstances, and then in Congo, and I understand in Liberia too. Steve McDonald has just arrived, very much an associate of Howard's, and I'm very pleased to see you here. Okay. As Jeff said, talking about this report, Trading for Peace, and I'll come back to that title in just a second because it requires some clarification, possibly even some challenge. But it is very much a preview in the sense that, as you'll see when I whiz through the PowerPoint presentation, which I just want to use as a very broad peg on which to talk. It's very much the result of some fairly intense research that was commissioned to get 4 research bodies to really look into how this wretched and controversial business of natural resource exploitation and trade really works. I'm always slightly worried about the expression "the true nature" of it, because finding the truth about this activity is very difficult and highly political and sensitive. But it is what we try to do, getting 4 different research bodies to look at it from different angles and understand the nature of it. There was quite a strong element in our initial vision for it, which we shared with Jay and the USAID team in Nairobi, that the moment was right, and again, that's highly challengeable, and we'll come back to that, to try and look at natural resource exploitation and its trade in a rather more positive framework, a rather more positive context. I think really most of the research on natural resource exploitation has been undertaken by the likes of Human Rights Watch, Global Witness, International Alert, really from the point of view of highlighting the abuses within the exploitation and the trade, and advocating, if you like, negative and punitive measures to stop it. Highly commendable work and extremely good research, I have to say, particularly the work that Global Witness has done, but also Human Rights Watch on gold. Very detailed research and highlighting the abuse, and particularly in the case of Human Rights Watch, highlighting the human rights abuse that, and particularly against women, that has been so tied into conflict in the Great Lakes region and the related natural resource exploitation. So I'll go through this presentation now. Jay was saying that Nick would go into the technical detail. Let me just say that my background is very much political analysis rather than economics. I've been working in DFID with an economist who I dearly wish was here, because she would be in a position to answer difficult questions on economic detail. If you have those questions, I'll certainly try to answer them, but I may plead ignorance and take note, well, it's being recorded anyway, and allow myself to get my colleague to follow up on them. So that's an early rider, but certainly in terms of the political context and, you know, what's happening, where can we take it, I will be very ready to answer questions. I will try and keep running through this presentation reasonably brief and headliney in order to keep time and space for an exchange of views and any particular questions that might come out. Just in terms of the process, as we said, this is a preview. Next week, we take the report, the draft report, to a meeting in Lusaka at COMESA's headquarters. And there we've got, I think, probably about 60 people now coming, mainly from Congo. From the Congolese side, a mixture of private sector, the FEC, the Fédération des Entreprises Congolaises, civil society and government, including, if they're allowed to come, and it seems that they will be allowed to come, customs officials, certification officials from Goma and Lumumbashi. We will also have some academics, some NGOs. I know Karina Tutsakian, who many of you will know from Global Witness, is coming. And the idea of that really is to critique it, not to edit it, but because the report, I think, will stand, but really to critique it, to see whether we have come up with, well, I'm confident that we've come up with a lot of detailed research, and it's a very solid evidence base from which to draw conclusions. But the key outcome of that meeting will really be to identify doables, implementables, policy interventions that will address this issue of natural resource exploitation and its trade. Because you know, at the end of the day, it's all fine and dandy getting some research done, but unless it's usable and used, it doesn't serve anyone's purpose. Okay, let's go to this presentation. The first page, as you see, is it's trading for peace. And we do argue in the paper that the dynamics of the Great Lakes region as a whole, and even the DRC, have improved. And the opportunities for stabilization and increasing peace are there. We argue furthermore that actually the promotion of trade in the interests of growth could then become part of a virtuous circle of greater trade is going to facilitate regional stabilization. It is going to hopefully stimulate real growth and poverty reduction inside DRC, which in turn will bring greater stability both within DRC and the region. So, but we're all conscious of what's happening in North Kivu at the moment. We're all conscious of the risk of reversion to conflict there right at this moment. I think we're all conscious of the continuing extreme fragility in the region, whether you're looking at the success story of Burundi, having gone through really wrenching ethnic conflict, to a transition that was managed and brought an election that brought a pretty good election that brought a legitimized government to power. That government is facing all sorts of problems. It's posing all sorts of problems. Similarly, in DRC, those transition processes are happening. There is, in the broad context, a stabilization, a movement towards greater peace. But we have to obviously be conscious of the backdrop of fragility and the risk of a reversion to conflict. No, I should face it that way, shouldn't I? Yeah, okay. You said it was a bit tired, didn't you? Okay, so the goal of the work in its original concept was to look at natural resource exploitation and to see how it could contribute to poverty reduction. That already slightly grates against the line that has been pursued, as I said, often by NGOs, that actually it contributes to conflict and conflict continuing the deep cycle of poverty. So what we were looking at was how we could promote growth through trade on the basis of a very sound understanding of how it works. We wanted to have a look, as Jay indicated, at the regional trade patterns. As you'll see, we focus very much on the trade out of Eastern Congo and Katanga through the Great Lakes and East Africa. There are other trade routes, of course, going to Southern Africa, going westwards out through Matadi. But for the purposes of this research, we focused on the eastward flows and also that flow out of Katanga that comes down through Kasumbalesi, the border point that was on the front page, and then comes up to Mbeya in Tanzania and across to Dar es Salaam, what's called the Southern Corridor. Okay, Jay, can we go on to the next one? The methodology and the approach. I think I don't need to go much more into working with USAID and COMESA, except to reiterate how important it was for both USAID and ourselves to have COMESA's participation. Major African regional-based economic organization looking at the promotion of trade. Getting their involvement and their participation was central to our being able to, if you like, take the report and its recommendations to governments to say, this is what we've found, what do you think, and where do you think that the private sector, civil society, the donor community can come in to help you on this. So it's very much aimed at going to the governments, going to the private sector in the region, civil society in the region, presenting them with the analysis and saying, how can we work together on these issues to promote the trade, to reduce the poverty. The terms of reference were as I've indicated, to really have this detailed study of the 6 principal corridors out of eastern and southern DRC, starting up in the north of Oriental, the Aru Mahagi crossing, and then going down to Mpondwe Kasindi, down to Goma Bukavu, Goma Giseni, etc., all the way down to the Zambian crossings at the south, the details of which will be in the report. And as we've said, the aim to understand the actual trade and the recorded and the official trade and the underlying reasons for the huge discrepancies within that. We'll come back to that. But suffice to say, at the moment, there is quite a lot of recorded data, and it's very varied, both in quality and in the figures that they have, even within the same organization. And then we were looking at what was required to enable the trade in minerals to... Oh, we've covered that point. Okay. All right, let's go on to the next slide, Jay. As I said, the report that is coming out, that we're previewing, if you like, is very much a synthesis of those 4 bits of research. As such, we hope that they will reflect both the analysis and view of the research organizations, and won't necessarily be an amplification of USAID views or DFID views, although the vision there is very much within what we're trying to achieve. Again, this is ground I've to some extent gone over. We're really looking at trade for growth, and looking at how to make that work. And it's our assertion that it can be made to work better, and that if it is working better, both in terms of governance structures, but in the promotion of livelihoods, etc., then that will have an impact on poverty reduction. And as we said, we do think, notwithstanding the fragility and the risks that are around, both in terms of political military risk of a reversion to conflict, but also the systemic problems within natural resource exploitation, that there is an opportunity now to really try and make an approach in a positive way rather than a negative way. Okay, the next one. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious, the first one, that, but it is a factor. People talk about the curse of gold or the resource curse. And in a conflict context, it is undoubtedly true that the link between conflict and natural resource exploitation has been shown brutally and repeatedly. And then starting to look at the mineral sector in particular, and particularly the artisanal small-scale mining, a lot of particular issues there that you need to sort of dig down into, whether it's the difference between concessions granted by government, local administrator, whoever, and the rights of people to that land. Same in forestry, big issues there. There are going to be major issues in the confrontation between artisanal small-scale mining and industrialization of mining, or rather, I think a better term is reindustrialization of mining, particularly in Katanga and the Kasais. I think those other ones we've largely covered, except to say that at the bottom, looking at it in the wider context is, we can all study natural resource exploitation and see it, but I think we need to see it in the context of impacts on livelihoods, the governance structures, or the lack of governance structures that condition the mining sector. We need to look at it in the context of security sector reform. Absolutely central to any moves forward in Congo is to have that at the top of the agenda. I think we also need to as Jay indicated, look at, and this is, if you like, USAID and DFID perspective, but we do tend to silo our work and look on a country basis. I think looking at this issue from a regional perspective, I think will enrich it and, if you like, open up potential entry points for us that we're really keen to examine. Okay, the role of trade. It's something that people do challenge, but and are surprised about. But actually, trade plays a huge role in the DRC and always has done. Even through the conflictual times, there has been trade, both export and import, and a huge amount of the proportion of GDP is trade, and it's a relatively, I've said very open in the slide, but it's a relatively open economy and relatively resilient. And the trade is very much both ways. But, one of the clear imbalances, not just of minerals and timber, but of other things, is that the export is almost entirely unprocessed. The imports are almost entirely processed, and that does bring an imbalance. And that immediately identifies a potential area of intervention. How can you add value inside the Congo. We'll come on to some of those, but just by way of one example, one of the main reasons why there are no industrial mines at all in eastern Congo, there are in Katanga and Kasai, is because there isn't any power, or there isn't enough power to run a mine, and even less to run processing plants. And so the ore is therefore taken out, smuggled out raw. There's very, very little added value for the Congo government or the Congo people in natural resource exploitation. The decades of bad governance, I mean, people have their different date as to how far back they want to go, but kleptocracy has ruled in Congo in a very high degree. Conflict also has meant that people have really looked for quick return activities, and rather than something like agriculture, where you've got to go out to the field, plant your beans, tend them, and then crop them a few months later. In an environment of insecurity, people stop doing that. Instead, they will go down a very dangerous old mine shaft to dig out what had been left from 20 years ago, or they will go to the tailings of an old mine to look there. So the agriculture sector in Congo has been largely abandoned. And you see that around the mining sites. I mean, around Mbujimai, very fertile land simply not being exploited. And the reason for that is that despite the risks and abuses that someone might get from being an artisanal miner, he will get paid $1 a day or $6 a day, depending on circumstances, and that's immediate cash rather than having to rely on 4 months' time for his beans going to market. The last point here is that, and it's a harsh point, but I think it's one that we need to face realistically, is that the value of the DRC's natural resources really remains minimal unless it's traded. There is very little use inside Congo for tin, and particularly unprocessed cassiterite. There's very little value inside Congo for diamonds. So unless it's traded, there is very little value for the Congolese people, for the Congolese government. There's very little even when it is traded, because of the systems of governance, the corruption, etc., that we'll come on to. But it's only if they're traded and if those systems of government are made more accountable and better, that there's a chance of greater accrual inside the country. One of the main problems that we found, as I indicated, was that should be data rather than date. Sorry about that. Is that the data is extraordinarily weak, both in terms of internal agencies, whether it's the Customs or the Central Bureau of Statistics in Kinshasa. they're very, very weak. The international or regional ones are pretty bad too. But as we'll see, one of the reasons why it is weak is because those who are trying to exploit the natural resources and trade them find that having weak data enables the fraud to happen that much more easily. So there's an incentive to keep the data weak that we looked at. This is where the economics get going, and this is if you like, a sort of almost an underestimation. The actual value of the exports is likely to be at least 3 times the official level recorded. And that's right across the board. And it's the case for imports as well as for exports. There should be a full stop, I'm sorry, there, after official level, and then full stop, imports as well as exports. Over 60% of what goes out of the DRC is not recorded. That's, when you think about that, that's a pretty high figure. And if you think about, if you were able to reduce that figure, then immediately you're talking about significant increase in revenue accrual for government, potentially significant recycling of money back into Congo. And as I said, these trading patterns are profoundly corrupt, and they're consciously fraudulent. What we mean by that is that essentially traders and state actors, whether it's the customs official or the military officer, will collude to undervalue either the undervalue or undervolume the export in order to take their cut of it. And we even found that in some places up in the Arua and Mahagi area, the various state actors were actually getting together to say, I want 5%, I want $45, I want... so let's go with a consolidated bid to the trader. And almost all of those were the informal charges or taxes rather than the formal ones. We'll get onto that. So these are just a few examples of the differentials that you can have a look at, and they're quite significant differences. And it includes imports at the bottom, as you can see, the petroleum imports that come in through Bondwe Kasindi to the Beni Butembo Triangle. 16,000 cubic meters declared, but actual import volume is 25,000. So a significant difference, coming up to 50% in that case. This total informalization of the economy has meant that traders, even where there are banking facilities, have chosen to find alternative methods. But actually, the banking system is largely broken down in the trading corridors. So that is inevitably in that the smallest trader, the person selling their tomatoes in the market, they're at the bottom of the pile and they get affected worse by that. But it does give a role that, in many cases is a legitimate activity, but in some cases it's taken beyond that, to middlemen, to replace, if you like, the absence of banking and other financial systems. And so it develops quite a sophisticated network of traders and middlemen. And just by way of example, there's a small trading town called Ariwara that is north of Arua and Aru, almost up on the Sudanese border with Congo, and where the Ugandan border joins, which is a thriving trading community, and the high street is a very open street, but it's full of these containers unpacking motorbike kits that have come in from China, and they're being assembled there. And traders from Sudan, even from Somalia, from Southern Africa, are coming up there to buy them. And there is a very scruffy trading shack. On the outside it says, "Buy your visas for Dubai here." And just an indication of how these networks are developing. The infrastructure I touched on in terms of energy, but roads too, is a major impediment to trade, and it also sort of creates the opportunities for the military to have a roadblock here, or it just generally enhances the opportunities for fraud. And it means that, getting your product smoothly down the market chain becomes that much more difficult. The fuel issue, again, absolutely critical in eastern Congo. In southern Congo, in Katanga, not quite so bad. So, heavy taxes and charges we've touched on, and they're really there are formal taxes and formal charges that are legitimate. Freight handling, freight clearance, export taxes, etc., etc. But the problem is that there's so many informal taxes and charges that it makes it very, very hard for the trader to trade regularly. And you will hear traders saying it's easier in Congo to trade illegally than legally. That's not necessarily particular to Congo, I know, but it is strongly felt there that it's when the state actors themselves, the customs officials, the security officers, are acting outside the law or breaking the law, that traders find it necessary to go around them. And so again, identifying ways in which that can be simplified and made cleaner would be a huge enhancement to the trade. There is a real issue of information that goes right through the study. For an artisanal miner who gathers up a few grams of gold, he has to sell it to the negociant to then take it to the wider market. If he has no idea what the spot price in Dubai is, he's subject to being screwed on it. So having that ability to use a mobile phone to call a trader in Dubai is enormously powerful. And that's starting to happen, but to a very, very limited extent. I mean, I was at Pondwe, the market between Uganda and DRC a few months back, and a woman calling Kampala to see how much the tomatoes and the beans were selling for in Nakasero market in Kampala, and then challenging the person who was trying to give her a ridiculously small price for the tomatoes. So mobile phones, I mean, it's not the way that aid works, but if we could just shower mobile phones and some money to use them, it would be enormously empowering, particularly for the small traders, but also for those trading gold. In terms of regulation, and this isn't, again, particularly new or particular to the Great Lakes region, but having less of it rather than more of it, I think simplification is the order of the day. The issue of customary law and state regulation is an intensely controversial and complex technical issue, but it is really, really important. And without going into the detail of it, I would say that our researchers have looked into that in quite a significant way to try and understand what are essentially strict contradictions between national law and local customary law. And that has been a major source of conflict in the region. So the implications, does it matter? I think, yes it does, without any hesitation. Corruption does make the trading chain that much more expensive, that much more difficult. It enables political elites, militarized elites, to keep their grip on it. One of the major things that we're looking for in the transition out of conflict to reconstruction and stabilization is reducing the role of political and military elites in what was, and to some extent still is, a militarized economy. So getting that Ituri warlord out of his charges that he imposes both on the artisanal miners and on the traders would be a good step towards a more regulated trade. As I say, tax revenue, an enormous amount is lost to government through fraud and inefficiency. All these things have deterred both local and international investors. They've deterred international development agencies too. And so, if you like, finding ways in which they can take part in the trade would be a good thing. The positive side, we've, if we can move on, Jay, thanks. We've had a look at some of these, but just to touch on them. We've looked at the relative piece, and particularly at the relativity of the piece, and I think we really do need to think positively in a cautious way. Within the if you like, internal process in the DRC and also in Burundi and Rwanda, the processes of decentralization, I think, have become and will become very, very important. Under the DRC constitution, in the decentralization plans, 40% of revenue accrued within a province should be held within that province rather than sent back to Kinshasa and lost, or come back to, as it's supposed to. That presents quite a strong incentive for provincial administrations to tax in an open, proper way, and then it creates a real opportunity for civil society and the provincial parliaments to challenge the provincial government to see how that money is being spent and whether it is being spent, in the delivery of services within the province. So it's a really strong incentive. I mean, the problem is that actually that 40% of revenues staying within the province is enshrined in the constitution, but they haven't actually turned that constitutional provision into legislation. So again, there's an issue of governance in Kinshasa and constitutional or legislative processes to go through. It was very interesting. Pole Institute, which is one of the, I think I've missed the slide, which goes into the 4 research institutes that we're involved in. So I'll come back to that. But Pole Institute in Goma, whom a lot of you will know, really fantastic local, deeply grounded research institute, had a workshop recently to look at the study that they'd done on our behalf with local businessmen, civil society, with local officials, and with the traders. And they were sort of pleasantly astonished, I think is a way of putting it, to see how much, not just the traders, but quite a lot of the officials too, of OCC and OGIFREM, were saying that it is a very difficult political and trading environment in which we're trying to work. But that's what it is, and we have to do it. But if it was more transparent and more accountable, we would be entirely happy with that. Even the customs officials from OFIDA, who make most of their money by side deals and sharing percentages, etc., etc. Some of them were saying that actually, if they had a regular salary, which they were paid, and if they had clear rules about what they should be taxing and what they shouldn't be taxing, they would have much easier and better lives and would be content with that. And I think they were saying that in a genuine discussion with the traders and civil society, rather than presenting a line to the outside world, because it was very much an in-house workshop. I think the role of civil society really needs to be stressed, because I think it's going to produce a real pressure point on government, on private sector too, to really try and get things sorted out and make them work in a more transparent way. And certainly when we're looking at implementable, I think a quick win and something that can be done relatively quickly. Some of the things like infrastructure are going to take a much longer time, but empowering civil society, farmers' unions, traders' associations to be more aware of what can and can't be done, to be better organized, to present a challenge function to authorities and represent the people who are trying to trade, will be really, really important. And I hope that one of the outcomes of this report will be identifiable areas where NGOs, particularly working with local partners, can say, this is a bit of work that we can take forward and then go into a bidding process to development agencies like AID or DFID or the Dutch or whoever. I think a point worth making is that the international market for commodities, particularly for minerals, is pretty buoyant. And a lot of that buoyancy, if that's the right word, particularly when it comes to minerals, is coming from China and India. And actually the timber, what we found is that perhaps 80% of the timber that comes out of DRC is actually used regionally in the construction and furniture industries in Kenya and Uganda, and even back in Eastern Congo. So, and a lot of that timber is coming out informally, i.e. unrecorded, but some of it is then going back, recorded, into Eastern Congo. And what's happening is that it's coming out as wet, rough-sawn plank to processing plants in Uganda, where it's treated, dried, and then it's being taken back into Congo. I know we were at Mpondwe looking at timber and the well-rehearsed claim that it's being smuggled out and taken to China and to Europe. And we saw this truck loaded with timber and got very excited about it. We realized that actually it was facing the wrong way. It was facing back into towards Kasindi. And that was exactly what had happened. It had gone to a processing plant in Uganda and was going back for the construction industry. Equally, Southern Sudan, an area we haven't touched on, but there is a similar sort of trade pattern out of Southern Sudan through East Africa. Now, particularly with quite a lot of money for reconstruction available in Southern Sudan, a lot of timber is coming out of DRC, being processed in Uganda, and then going into Southern Sudan for the burgeoning reconstruction there. In terms of looking forward and what can we do, as I've said, I think it's very, very important, and Jay touched on this too, that we have a broad approach. There's no point really in just looking at cassiterite or coltan and studying that and seeing what can or can't be done about it. The issue of the exploitation and trade of cassiterite is a governance issue. It's very much a livelihoods issue. It is an issue of economics and finance, and it needs to be taken within that broad context. The next line, that natural resource exploitation is really the only show in town, might rankle with some people. And it's not meant to be confrontational with that, but what it is meant to say is that really at the moment, in terms of generating wealth from inside Congo, natural resource exploitation is about the only thing that is doing so, and that could do so in a really significant way in terms of changing the dynamics of growth. Addressing that exploitation does seem to be important. We looked, as I said, really in terms of the broad approach at sort of 4 areas: trade, livelihoods, economics and finance, and governance. And then within all of those, 2 principal cross-cutting issues. The overarching one of peace and security, without which not a lot's going to happen. And the underlying one of capacity. Capacity right across the board, whether it's in the marketplace or in government offices in Kinshasa. So I can touch very, I'm conscious that I probably talked far too long, but let me just very quickly run through these 4 areas and identify where we think there are real needs, and where, when we take this report to the Lusaka meeting, as I mentioned, we will look to people to say, that's what you ought to be doing. So looking at livelihoods first, a lot of these points we've really touched on, but there are an enormous number of people involved in natural resource exploitation and in trade, particularly in Congo, but going down the chain to the export points of Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. And so the potential to enhance livelihoods right the way through from mine to market is very strong, but is beset by all the issues that we've been discussing. There's a particularly environmental concern in both forestry, which is technically renewable, but the cycle is a very, very slow one. But the other resources are non-renewable, and so that issue of non-renewable resources and the environmental impact of a lot of the reindustrialization, a lot of the building of roads so that people can get their produce to market, also enables illegal loggers to get the timber out. So all those issues need to be looked at. And the low value added that exists right across the natural resource exploitation field. So looking at the needs, we think there's a real need to diversify livelihoods. I think it's inevitable in Katanga and the Kasai that there is going to be a reindustrialization of mining, and machines will replace miners, and those miners will lose their jobs. I think it's incumbent on governments in the region, working with external agencies like ourselves, but also, and particularly the private sector, to look at ways to mitigate that livelihood loss. And I think diversification is attractive, particularly when we're looking at diversification into agriculture, because agriculture, or the revitalization of agriculture, is an end in itself, and I think a really important area for growth. But it will offer opportunities for people to find alternative livelihoods. In some areas, like the Kivus, we very, very firmly believe that actually the sort of mining that is most sensible sensible, used cautiously, both in terms of making money out of it, but also in, if you like, looking at livelihoods and environmental issues. The most sensible way of mining in the Kivus, I think, will remain artisanal. So what we need to do there is look at ways to, if you like, safeguard artisanal mining, enhance artisanal mining, rather than look to ways to replace it or diversify out of it. The increasing the local value added, we've gone through a great deal. Labour markets and skills is interesting because at the moment, if you live in Kindu, for example, and you're a teacher, it's quite likely that you won't have been paid for the last 4 months or even longer. And even if you are paid, it's a pretty small sum. So either as a seasonal vacation job or in times of real hardship during term time too, quite a lot of the teachers take themselves off to become porters and diggers. And earning their $6 a day from that, however risky it is a better safety net for their families than being a teacher. So looking at ways in which, and this is, I think, not just government, but faith-based organizations can, if you like, rebuild the education sector, and this goes back to the broad approach, is going to be very important in terms of livelihood. Teachers, obviously, just one example. And I mean, there is a buoyant international market and a growing regional market, but developing those both externally for exports, but also imports is going to be an important thing. Okay, trade. This is looking inwards. There's a very large domestic market and very strong potential to develop that. There's a very high demand in neighbouring countries for timber. A more formalised structure of trade is going to help government at both national and provincial level. A more formalised or transparent trading regime in the border areas and the corridors will impact positively on local traders. There'll be some who particularly benefit from the informal nature of trade, and they are potential spoilers, no doubt about that. But the broad majority of the traders and those who depend on local produce will benefit. So facilitating the trade routes, and I mean an awful lot of work is already going on in terms of the Northern Corridor, facilitating the trading system between Kenya and Uganda. But if that can be extended to facilitating the crossing points in Rwanda and Uganda, both in terms of infrastructure, but also the facilitation of trade, and whether that's moving to guichet unique or one-stop shops or other handshaking of computers or whatever, there is an enormous amount of work potentially that can be done there. And the information exchange at borders, I think, is going to be very important. Again, on this, the economic and financial situation, we've touched on the dysfunctional nature of the economy. Looking at the needs, again, within the economic and finance sector, infrastructure and energy is absolutely central. Without those two, it's going to be quite difficult to regenerate things. the need to look at the small traders as much as the big companies, and public finance management is there too. In terms of governance, looking at the needs, as I said earlier, I think there's a need to simplify and streamline rather than get more legislation, more rules about trading, etc., etc. Peace and security is the overarching need in governance, and information comes there as well. I'm not going to spend long on this last one because I think really most of the points have been covered. But what I would say is, we are very, very conscious, and the researchers were, that looking at the positives in a pretty negative scenario is controversial, is to some extent confrontational, but what I would ask is that when the report is available, have a look at the evidence base from which we've tried to draw these conclusions, that there is an opportunity and that we should take that opportunity to try and reduce poverty and increase regional stabilization through trade and growth. Let me stop there. Sorry, I've gone on an awful long time, but I wanted to give some sort of flavour of the nature of the research. Just in terms of when the report is going to be available, as I said, we're taking it to Lusaka next week. And then I hope that within a month after that we will have a final document which we will make public, and it'll obviously be posted on the DFID and the USAID websites and will be publicly available. We then will want to, if you like, take it on a roadshow to governments, private sector, civil society in the region. We want to take it to other donors because we, between USAID and DFID, will have some ideas of interventions that we can make, but we will be looking to others, and there are other donors who are showing a lot of interest. We'll also want to take it to the IFIs, who I think will have a role. They're already heavily involved in transport, power, whether it's Africa Development Bank or the bank itself here. So we'll want to take it out, and we will want to solicit responses from people, both in terms of critiquing it, but also looking at what can be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. There's quite a lot to it, and so there's both the report and the issues. So why don't we take some questions and for some discussion? Perhaps we'll group a few, take a couple at a time, and give our panelists an opportunity to respond. Because we are webcasting this meeting live, and then we'll have the video archived online, we ask that you wait till one of my colleagues brings you a microphone and let us know who you are, and put your question to the microphone as well as to the panel. So who would like to kick us off? Steve, up here in the front.
Yeah.
Hi, Steve McDonald, consulting project manager with the Woodrow Wilson Center's African Leadership Programs. Fascinating, Nick. I wish we could have a copy of the report sooner rather than later. Very interesting. You know the kind of work we've been doing in the DRC. In general, you've been very, very supportive of it there and in Burundi. And we've been working very much in the Kivus and in Turi, and plan to be working in Katanga and Kasai, and working in Kinshasa. Now, basically, our work has been pointed towards a leadership grouping. The decentralization issue that you brought up several times is extremely important because in the post-election period now, we've been working more and more with provincial legislatures and provincial leaders, both government and outside of government, also working with the 8th Brigade, military command, and we're going to be doing a lot of security sector reform as we've done in Burundi. I'm saying all of that very quickly because it's a backdrop to the fact that the Congolese have come to us, particularly as we're talking about doing some work in Katanga and Kasai, have come to us and brought up the issue of resource exploitation and trying to bring in the traders and including the international players into the dialogues and workshops that we've been doing. It's something that Michel Casa, if you haven't talked to in Kinshasa, you should be talking to, has been very deeply involved in the conversation on, and we may well be doing. The kind of research that you've been involved in here, particularly with the Poli Institute, would be extremely helpful as we're going forward with these dialogues and seeing what we'll set up. Right now, we're extremely involved in North and South Kivu, and Howard is there now. That's why he's not here. And looking more at the fragility of the situation as it now exists. But the next round, as we go into October and November, we're going to be looking at this very issue. And just to let you know that we're very hungry for your research and your findings and knowing more about this as we start any kind of conversations. Michel Casa has flown into Katanga a couple of times now and talked with some of the traders, both the international players and the locals and the officials, and this issue is just really, really important to them. And so somehow we would like to see ourselves as an implementer of your findings. So we need to be talking very closely about this.
Good. Thanks.
Why don't we go straight across the table and then we'll come over here.
Thanks. I'm Eric Nelson. I'm the country economist at the World Bank for Liberia. Before that, I was country economist for DRC and Burundi, so I've worked in the area. First, a comment, because Steve mentioned the decentralization, that while it is true that in DRC that they are decentralizing as part of the Constitution, a difficulty we found in trying to do governance of natural resources and having revenue sharing with the local people and input from the local people is that the smallest unit which has fiscal autonomy in the DRC is a territoire, which is the first subunit of the province and consists on average 450,000 people. So when you start talking from the governance side about sharing revenues at the local level and the role of the state, you aren't there yet in DRC. If you compare that to in Burundi, where they are decentralizing to the colline level, it makes a very big difference. Secondly, to add to a bit to a good report, but to clarify the title a little bit, I believe that you're really talking about two topics here. You're talking about regional trade and its contribution to peace, and you're also talking about export promotion in DRC and its contribution. I think the paper would be clearer if in the future that you differentiate that the export promotion is largely one way. And as the talk proceeds, as the paper proceeds, you do get into the regional trade, but it would help if you distinguish the two slightly.
Terrific. That does make me also think, because here at the center we're not, at least the Environmental Change and Security Program, not one particular region. Makes me think that it would be also perhaps one additional input would be to look at some of these decentralization processes in natural resources in other parts of the world that have worked disastrously and in fact accelerated poor governed resource extraction. I'm thinking particularly post-Suharto Indonesia, where the decentralization process actually, particularly in the forestry sector, meant many more trees with much less control and much decentralized corruption. So learn some of those negative lessons from other parts of the world as well. We have a question here.
Lawrence Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review. I have two issues I want to see if you could address. One is on the exploitation, because there's a history from, I guess, the 98, 99 on, that both Kagame and Museveni went in and stole everything they could with no objection, really, from the British, U.S., or the West. So this has continued, and I'm told today that even the major cartels are fighting the government for how much they can take out of the Congo. And I don't think that, at least what you presented, that wasn't put forth as a continual problem, unless you don't think it is one. And the second thing is on the question of the economy. I know you focused on decentralization, but don't you really need a national program to build a national economy with national railway grids, national road grids, national power grids, and that won't be accomplished decentralized, but would be accomplished by a government with significant aid and credit from the West for those infrastructure programs? Thank you.
Sure. Why don't we take those, and then I see some more hands for a second round.
Okay. Shall I have a quick run through of those questions? First of all, Steve would be delighted if you become a partner in this. That's good news. The decentralization issue is. I mean, I take the point about the complexity of Congo, and where do you start? It's not a simple thing. I think the researchers have looked into, if you like, the levels of, if you like, decentralization and tried to understand how that works. So I didn't address it in this presentation, but there is some addressing of it in the four bits of research. I mean, I do take the point that there are two strands to this report. I mean, there is, if you like, sort of regional stabilization. It's something that we're looking at, if you like, in a conflict or post-conflict context, and the need for it, and the separate exercise of promoting trade of natural resources and other commodities out of Congo. But I do think that they are linked in this virtuous circle that I was describing right at the beginning, in that greater regional stabilization, greater, if you like, observance of trading practices in neighboring countries like Uganda and Rwanda, as well as in DRC, will all lead not only to the promotion of trade, which whose main beneficiary will be the DRC, but there'll be benefits down the value chain for the others too. But it promotes greater working together. If whether we take the issue of Lake Kivu methane or Lake Albert oil, at the end of the day, those natural resources will be much better exploited, and better exploited for local benefit on a collaborative basis between the countries, perhaps working through ZPGL or just bilaterally, than in confrontation. So I do think that there are links, and we consciously try to link them. In terms of decentralization being a disaster elsewhere, and the example of the Indonesian forest, I think again it's something that is touched on in the analysis and the research. But I mean, it is a real issue that in the process of reform or restructuring, the sequencing, not just of decentralization, but the sequencing of building roads, for example, becomes absolutely critical. The bank comes in and builds a very fine road ahead of a serious application of the forestry code, even if it's there on paper, simply enables quick grab concessionaires getting in there, getting their logs onto the good road and out quickly. Just to touch on the 2 points that you made, the issue of regional involvement in natural resource exploitation has been, it was, I would argue, very much in a conflict context. That's not to diminish the severity of the exploitation, but I do think that in those years, and I do think it has changed significantly, not completely, but in those years, anybody who had any form of either political or military power within Congo or within the region simply went into that Wild West and grabbed what they could. That we didn't condemn it. There's a long story there that I don't think that we've got time for, but essentially the bottom line was that we worked, if you like, within the system to try and put a stop to it, lessen it. But at the end of the day, particularly in the case of DFID and UK government, we were at that time very, very committed, for I think good reasons, to poverty reduction support in Uganda and Rwanda, and we were conscious of other things going on in Eastern Congo and on the political space agenda that we were clearly uncomfortable with, but chose to, if you like, parallel policies rather than have one determine the other.
Let me just make a couple of clarifications here on this report. I think one of the things is that you need to manage expectations of what this report can do for you. Let's just be honest about it. When we sat around and discussed the initial setting, the framework of this report and who to pick and how to go about it, was we all knew that we're not going to get 100% of the problem solved, maybe 20% if we're lucky. And from that perspective, what can we do for that 20%, which I think is fairly large in this area, and a very positive first step. And again, this is just a first step. Most of the reports and most of the analysis we've had or done in the past, or seen in the past, have been from, as Nick pointed out, from advocacy groups. Very punitive, but extremely good analysis, but very punitive in the recommendations. From a government standpoint, from an intergovernmental standpoint, really the U.S. government, UK government, and the governments in this region, we wanted to do something that was, if we sponsored something, we wanted to make sure this is something more collegial, more collaborative in its approach. From that perspective, we wanted to sort of get analysis and evidence that our missions can bite off and chew. It's okay, from the Rwanda perspective, what can we do here? From the DRC perspective, what can our mission do there? And similarly for Uganda. From that sort of broader that perspective, how do we approach this issue of extractive industries and trade and that whole ball of wax there? So that's the main thing, is we need to manage expectations. This report has done a lot of in-depth analysis. We've got great data on different border posts. But again, put that in context of what's in our management interest as governments. And put that in the context of what's in the management interest of various governments, and French and Belgians, and when we sit down together with them. Because the process now has been building a demand-driven. As Nick and I pointed out, we actually met with the Office of the President in Uganda, and when we first explained what we're trying to do, of course, they all stiffened up and said, hey, you're going to do what? Look at trade and extractive industries? That really got them going. But when we said this is led by COMESA, and we're supporting COMESA's approach to facilitating trade in the region, we got 100% buy-in from them. They said, fine, and if that's the case, if that's your approach, and if that's what you're going to stand by, then we're in it. And that's the process we want to follow. We want to make this demand-driven so that whatever happens in the end, it may not be the perfect scenario, but it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, go ahead.
Lawrence, can I just come back to you on your second question? I apologize that I didn't address that before we go on to the second one, on building central economic planning as well as regional ones. I think that's that's a debate that goes on in all countries, and the dichotomy or the tension between focusing on central government and building that up and developing decentralized plans. The only thing that I'd say on that is that I think an awful lot of work is going on in Kinshasa at building a centrally driven plan. And I think that is absolutely critical. And just by way of an example, the program on developing infrastructure, Pro-Roots, is Kinshasa-based, working with the bank and the commission and a number of donors to rebuild both primary roads and feeder roads. What we're trying to do is to work through the Ministry of Plan and the Transport Agency within that, both to, if you like, get them to take the responsibility not only for the building of the roads, but the maintenance of them afterwards. But clearly, as part of central government's plan, there is a policy of decentralization. And I think that centrally driven decentralization policy offers interesting opportunities for us as the international community to work to, if you like, help that decentralization process.
Yeah, Tim Resch, USAID Africa Bureau. It strikes me that the recommendations are coming strong towards a supply focus rather than a demand focus, and kind of following out the value chain. That, as far as USAID and DFID and COMESA are concerned, looking at the throughout the value chain at the processors and the ultimate consumers of these natural resources, a lot of that pressure comes more out of the NGO community and the popular press than pressure by government agencies on the private sector, and so the kind of focusing on the your recommendations also on the say what you pay side of resource exploitation might be strengthened in your report and recommendations.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Christy Buckley from the Climate Institute. I actually wrote my master's dissertation on DRC and the Forest Code. And one of the things I came across was that, ironically, the conflict in the DRC actually largely protected the forest from being logged. And now that that's more stable, this is obviously a growing trend there. And as I understand it, about 70% of the population is directly dependent upon the forest for fulfilling their basic needs. And so I'm wondering, with increased logging through trade, how you envision this translating into improvement for people's livelihoods, and how you ensure that this doesn't result in sort of resource-based conflict again in the future.
My name is Karashui. I'm the ambassador of Mauritius. I'd like to raise two issues essentially. One relating to the challenges that many countries in the region have to face, in view of the fact that they belong to several regional groupings. And very often there are lots of policy incoherences. If I take the case of SADC and COMESA, for instance, I wonder if you factored this in the work that you've done with COMESA. The second thing is, by and large, I think, from the experience that we've seen elsewhere, although the situation is not comparable, but I think there are lessons to be drawn for DRC from Liberia and Sierra Leone. And the fundamental lesson is quite simply that you have to put institutions in place that will create trade capacities for these countries, and the critical importance of public-private partnership. Final point I want to make, I don't particularly like the term resource exploitation. It implies a bunch of predators going around and exploiting. This has been the case. Maybe we have to find a better term. I heard somebody from the World Bank using the expression governance of resources. At the risk of sounding a bit undiplomatic, I'd like to ask you a question. Is there really a political will and determination to change the status quo? Isn't there a bunch of new, I was going to use the term predators, but shall we say investors, who want to maintain the status quo? Let's be very honest about it. In many parts of Africa, the biggest resistance to change has been from powerful vested interests that would care for the welfare of the few against the fate of the many. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I'm going to take a first crack at this. Thank you, Excellency. Those are very good points you made. I'm going to start with your observations first. In terms of various RECs, or the regional economic groups out there, versus SADC, versus COMESA, versus now EAC, East African Community, the only forum where DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda sit in is COMESA. Because SADC obviously it's a much more powerful trading bloc in terms of resources, with South Africa being the linchpin there. But Rwanda is not a part of SADC. And to get them to talk to each other, there's some history to this. Back in 2004, the U.S. government sort of helped set up the fusion cell between the 3+1, the tripartite +1 process, and that led to open more doors of dialogue. And then this is what was sort of an offshoot of that dialogue. And then we had to find a REC that would take the lead on this, and we already had a mechanism through COMESA. So there's some political expediency here in terms of what the U.S. government is supporting. And COMESA was the only trading bloc that had all the 4 countries at the same table. And now you have East African Community, which is now a competitor. So you have these various groups out there, but we're hoping for African Union to sort of finesse this a little bit, so there's less competition between these regional groups, and more cooperation between SADC and COMESA and IGAD and EAC, because there's just so much of overlap between countries and memberships. And I think COMESA, the Peace and Security Desk, is sort of competing against IGAD's conflict early warning program. That said, we approached COMESA because that was expedient, and also for 2 reasons. One, all the 4 countries were at the table, and secondly, we had a direct funding mechanism and an activity with them to sort of take this forward. That said, on the terms of lessons for DRC from Liberia and Sierra Leone, I think the issues of scale, given the scale, the size of DRC, translating what's happened in Sierra Leone and Liberia becomes very challenging when you look at it from a larger scale perspective. From individual territory perspective, yes, it makes sense, but from a larger consolidated approach, it becomes a little more difficult. And again, we want to approach that when we get to the bridge, when we think of funding activities and how do we want to fund those activities, and what do we fund, and how do we do it. I think for that right now we want to report that all the governments in the region can bite off and say, okay, we agree with this report, and then they take it forward. Our main thing right now is, or I shouldn't say mine, but I think DFID and USAID's main thing thrust right now is to get the governments to bite off on the analysis. Once they agree to the analysis, then taking it forward in terms of implementing activities that are demand-driven becomes a little more easier. Because most of the analysis has been, I guess, mentioned through NGOs and nonprofits or advocacy groups that often rankle the host government. So we wanted to have a process where we could get the governments to buy into this analysis and then sit down with them. Okay, now what do we do next? And that's why I think Nick is going to Lusaka and then to other roadshow to get the governments to buy into the analysis and get their input, get their take on it, and then we can take the next step forward of implementing it. On your points of public-private partnerships, I mean that's sort of the core of this approach. And in terms of political will, if you look at the leadership in the region, they're all. You have a couple of strongmen there, in terms of Kagame, in terms of Museveni, but they still have an international audience that they're talking to. Both UK and US are big donors. They both realize the political expediency of looking at this analysis. It's non-threatening analysis. We're going to look at just very select activities that they agree to, and that they're willing to work with COMESA on. So it's not the whole 100%. It's relatively 20%, and then that's our first step, and then build the political will and opportunity cost, lower the opportunity cost to go further than that. And Tim, I want to go back to your question of supply versus demand focus. It's a sort of hybrid process we're looking at in this report. It looks like a supply-driven process, but actually, if you do the nuance to it, we want to get the African governments to make this a demand-driven process. They buy into it, and then they work with the Chinese and Indians to sort of figure a way out that they can get a better share of the profits or the revenues. back into their government coffers. I think I'll turn it to Nick for the more
Okay, let me just touch briefly on a couple of aspects that Jay hasn't covered. Forests. One of the researchers, and actually this gives me an opportunity to say who